A big welcome to our live audience for the Digital Health Investor Talk show. I'm your host, Stephen Wardell. I'm the managing partner of Wardell Advisors, a digital health advisory firm, and the author of The Future of Digital Health. Wardell Advisors is helping digital health companies boost growth, raise funding, find trade sale buyers, and create new strategic alternatives, giving you more options in today's challenging environment. You can follow me at x.com/Stephen Wardell. Our show today is on the topic of From GenAI to Patient Agency in Healthcare. Our guest today is David Shaywitz, MD, PhD. David's a lecturer in the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School and is a senior health tech and biopharma executive who recently joined Lore Health as chief medical scientist. This show is being recorded and will be included in our podcast series called The Digital Health Investor Talk Show. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify and leave us a review. We always love getting 5-star reviews. We have new podcast links, and so make sure that you see recent show episodes when you subscribe or you're on the old page. This is not investment advice, and we are not investment advisors. Here's the format of today's show. The show is 90 minutes long, and David and I will spend the first half discussing the news and the macro picture and conferences and some other topics. And then the second half will focus on our special topic of the day. And we'll be taking your questions throughout in the text chat. So, David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Will do. But first of all, Steve, what a soothing voice you have. I'm listening to this, and it's just the dulcet tones. So it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As mentioned, I'm a physician scientist who spent about 25 years at the intersection of medicine, biology, and behavior, working across biotech and health tech to bring powerful emerging technologies from stem cells and AI and genetics to digital health and AI to bear in service of patients. Over the last several years, I've become increasingly focused on something I believe is foundational, cultivating agency, which is the belief that you can make a positive difference in the world. I got started with these ideas really as a passion project. It's something I call Kindwell Health, and now I'm building on them in my day job at Lore. Essentially, it's a capacious view of health that embraces not just physiology, but connection and purpose in the sense that you can really make a difference and you can really shape your future. A conviction that turns out to be critically important, not only for health, but for a deeper sense of flourishing.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. And I guess that's probably agency for the provider and also the patient. And I just had an experience recently where I began looking into healthcare medical alternatives around longevity and performance, and I found it bewildering. And I found my sense of agency stunted by that. There were so many things making claims I didn't half believe, and so I think I can see a role here for a good doctor or even for an AI chatbot that's truth-telling to kind of clear things up a little bit.
Well, Steve, it's kind of interesting. There's one of the books that I reviewed maybe 2 years ago was called Super Agency by Reid Hoffman, the guy who started LinkedIn. And his sort of basic question was whether technology is going to enhance agency which is sort of what his argument was, by sort of supercharging us and allowing us to do all sorts of things we never would have imagined we'd be able to do, or whether it's going to suppress or dampen agency, as sort of some of the doomers worry about, and is going to, by sort of making decisions for us, we're going to sort of wind up in some sort of anesthetized state just while the world's going by us and we're like clicking enters at most.
Yeah, well, and I think we still don't know. There's clearly some people gain super agency and other people find that the option of having all the world's entertainment since the beginning of time available to you at your fingertips in your home is just too seductive for others.
Yeah, I think clearly what's so interesting, right, is that we're in the process, just the very beginning of the process, I know I'll get to, of even how to engage with the new technology. But what is interesting is for every new technology, newspapers, the printing press, everything, when it arrived, everyone's like, oh my goodness, this is the end of civilization, the end of humanity, the end of everything. And then pretty soon, people adjusted to it and then figured out how to leverage it. And even if some of the original or, the nature of work changed, it wasn't like all of work was over. It was just evolved. The famous prediction that everyone is just going to work, some small number of hours a week didn't really quite materialize. And in fact, as you're able to produce things cheaper, you're able to, costs go down, and then you wind up increasing demand. And then all of a sudden, what people thought was a fixed demand, maybe you'd want one shirt and one pair of pants a year. Now, all of a sudden, people want lots and lots more. So it's sort of as we get more efficient doing things, the demand and the variety can dramatically increase.
Thank you. Well, so now we'll move on to the section of our show, which is macro news. And so I'll just discuss the macro picture. And we look at this from the lens of how this affects the innovation economy. So the innovation economy is young company leaders doing innovative things and the investors who back them. That's the innovation economy. And so for our audience, feel free to throw any questions in the chat that you'd like. And so first I'll look at, I think that the NASDAQ had been rising for a while and now it's down. It's down today and it's down in recent past. And this is over war fears. And the war fears are a number of things, but I think a big element of it is a possible energy shortage or energy supplies, put in question over war fears. And that this can lead to the price of oil spiking and it can lead to a slowing down of economies. There's even possible food uncertainty following after that for parts of the world. So growing uncertainty in public markets, and it's also reflected somewhat in private markets as well. I've heard of investors who are acting a little askance, or they want to keep their money safe instead of making bets that private market bets like venture capital that take 8 years to pay out. Also, I've seen Israeli companies and Israeli investors have been hurt by this, and so an Israeli company that might be able to raise money in Israel might now be seeking to raise money in the U.S. because Israeli investors are shy of investing in today's environment as well. There's also not a lot of, I think yesterday markets were up on Trump saying that this might be a short war, but there's just a lot of growing uncertainty. So, David, any thoughts on the
Well, I'm
and
learning a lot from you, Steve. I tend to look more at longer term trends and watch how things evolve over time. And I mean, even for the companies, there's a huge amount of incredible innovation in Israel for sure, and in other countries in the region, in fact. And you tend to think that whatever the challenges over the very short term, in the long term, great innovation and great insights are going to be rewarded. And there's just too much. I mean, from a medical perspective, there's too much need for that not to happen.
So in other news, so we're in an interest rate cutting cycle, and that's good news for the innovation economy. So for young company leaders and investors, bonds could be competition for investing in young companies. And so if interest rates are coming down, it means new bonds are at lower rates. It means that people need to invest in growth in order to have a payout in the future. And so we're in an interest rate cutting cycle, and that's been good for the last couple of months. And then also, I think there's a lot of concerns that the economy is basically in a recession, except for the economic activity of what sometimes is called the Magnificent Seven or the Magnificent Ten. So these are the big public companies that are benefited by AI. So this is like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and others. And they've seen a lot of stock market lift, while other companies have not seen a lot of stock market lift. And they've committed to giant investments and a build out of plant. And this seems to be driving economic activity. But there's concern that that we would basically be in a recession without this, and that the economy for most Americans is a recession. And then, but any other thoughts from our audience that you'd like us to comment on, or from you, David? So it's a mixed picture for innovators who would like there to be better conditions than there are right now. So. Well, so then we'll move on to our next section, which is a little bit about the environment for valuation, fundraising, consolidation, M&A, and IPOs. And for our audience, feel free to throw any questions you have in here. Really interesting. What's been happening in the public markets. So first, there has been a speculated what I'll call SaaS collapse. So many public software companies are SaaS companies, which means software as a service, and it refers to the way they sell software, not the old software publishing model, but the moderately new SaaS model where they're renting out seats in their single instance software in the cloud. And this has been powering a lot of Wall Street software returns and NASDAQ returns for a long time. And there's been speculation that software building and AI business models are going to rapidly undermine the SaaS companies. And so SaaS companies have often traded in the 5 to 7 times revenue run rate for a long time. And during the bubble years, some of the fast growing young SaaS traded at 15 to 20 times revenue, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And what we've seen more recently is a real collapse in SaaS valuation levels. And we don't see this reflected so much in the NASDAQ. because of the weight of the NASDAQ toward the Magnificent 10. But it sort of represents the old software business model, the now old software business
What
model.
do you think of that, Steve? Do you think that's an overreaction? Because, like every other episode of like 20 VC, right, is sort of like SaaS is dead, this is dead, that is dead. Everything has been killed by the latest models. But then on the other hand, if people say, oh, well, actually, when you reflect on it, SaaS probably isn't dead, but they probably aren't going to get the multiples that they used to get. But it sounds like you're really engaged in that. What does that seem? Do you feel like it's an overreaction?
Yeah, so I think it probably is an overreaction, but we've seen these valuation levels go from 5.5 times revenue run rate to 3.7 times revenue run rate over the last couple of months. That's lower than expected. So there's a belief, number one, that new small competitors will enter and will rapidly build what the SaaS companies have to offer with new techniques and then compete with them head to head. And there's also a belief that there'll be new products that are different from SaaS company products that have different feature functionality, not having to do with how fast you write the software, but rather with the features of the software that will perhaps both led by GenAI, both will undermine the incumbents then. And that's the fear. When I see a lot of GenAI products that have been rapidly built, it's ones that aren't quite up to professional grade, where there's 1,000 use cases that have to do with safety or convenience or whatever. And so the new AI products I've seen are brittle. They're not ready to go. If you run a sales team of 200 people, field-based nationwide Salesforce, you might want to customize it further, but you're not going to want to give up your existing model, which has been hardened and tested over time. But they may see that competitors are undercutting their prices somewhat. But I think we're going to have these legacy software systems with us for a while because they're so secure, so reliable. Workforces are
And in
trained.
highly regulated environments, right? Like you can vibe code whenever you want, but when you're gonna bring it to the FDA and it's sort of gonna be, wait, you did what now? Like that's gonna be it's gonna be more questionable.
Yeah, so software, so CRM software for pharma, MedReg software for pharma, document management software, clinical trial automation software, all in theory, none of it has to go to the FDA, but in practice, you have to be able to attest that you meet IT security standards and regulatory levels and that sort of thing.
I mean, I do think it's really been interesting watching the challenges that AI has faced in terms of adoption in the enterprise, right? Because it really is like the security concerns and the familiarity with the existing approaches. So I think there have been, an infinite number of pilots as everybody has described, but then getting beyond the pilots, it's been less rapid than in most domains, I'm sure software than, some domains are exceptions, but in sort of most domains, it hasn't had the rapid transformational impact that some were sort of anticipating, it sounds like.
Yeah, and just some reflections on that. I was just in New York and I got to walk around the offices of one of the most famous private equity firms in America. And it's organized with the big glass offices are the managing director's offices, and then the little cubicles on the inside are the junior workers. And in my day, working in that environment, you had only one screen, and the screen had Microsoft Excel on it. And when I walked past them, I saw they have two screens, so that's a nice step up if you're one of those workers. And one of the screens had Microsoft Copilot on it. I'm sure they could choose what to put on the screen, and every one of them had Microsoft Copilot running on their screen. So it certainly has become the step of choice for young knowledge workers, and they probably have approval from their enterprise to use Microsoft Copilot. Now, interestingly, Jason Calacanis of the All In podcast, he has said on record, if you're a young, innovative company doing things around AI, do not use OpenAI. Use somebody else. He says because he says they have access. Google knows what your search terms are when you search, and that's a measure of intent. Because they'll know what you're running.
Do you mean Google or do you mean OpenAI? AI is
Right.
Google.
So we've all used Google search for a long time, and search terms in old Google search is a measure of intent.
Yes.
And so Jason Calacanis is specifically upset about OpenAI, and he's saying, are you going to participate in the OpenAI AI app store as a young company? Well, don't. Are you going to have your employees do searches on OpenAI? Well, don't. He is saying because he's claiming that he knows Sam Altman, and Sam Altman has his eye on the revenue of all those companies. But this gets to, if you do confidential things as a company, do you want your young employees typing in AI searches all the time on any platform where you're now revealing that information to that party.
So, can I give you an interesting example of this, of how it sort of manifests in healthcare? So this came up on actually the NEJMAI podcast, where one of the hosts, or Raj, was talking how, so, in hospitals, right, the adoption of some of these of some of these Gen AI systems, is that, they're very, 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 very conservative, as you may have heard, as I know you know. And so it's sort of like, well, can things can only go approve when the CIO and everybody approves it. And so there's a sort of this very, intimidating process. In practice, he said every single physician he passed was like on their phone using open evidence, basically, which is, like a Gen AI power, incredibly highly valued Gen AI powered approach to do things. And some were using actually Chat GPT. And so it's sort of an interesting dilemma, because it's sort of, on the one hand, here's what's formally allowed. On the other hand, these tools are so disproportionately useful that for the people who are involved, they feel like they're not going to be providing their patients with the best care possible. And then you really are in a dilemma. Like for these cases, obviously no one wants to expose private patient information to these platforms, but it's not great for your ecosystem if everybody is sort of cowboying off on their own, and in you're trying to have everything done in a regulated way. But on the other hand, if you're so fuddy-duddy that you're kind of inhibiting, and this is a huge issue for pharma, where they're so concerned. And so, I was there actually when, AI started to come into the enterprise there. It was just like, publicly, it was like embracing AI. Privately, it's like, yeah, you can do it, but just do it over here in this box with this caveat and that caveat and that caveat, and not using a real version. And it's sort of like, if it's actually useful, you're going to want to use it in a much more blown out way.
And Elon Musk has encouraged people to upload their medical records to X for Grok to evaluate. The trouble is you're probably giving your medical records. And so they would like to have a whole bunch of X-rays of broken wrists to analyze. But then you've sort of given your rights away. And for most people, they think it'll never affect them in a negative way. But you should just be knowledgeable about that. And so Jen asks, are there IP concerns around using OpenAI or Claude AI, given the lack of confidentiality, the lack of attorney-client privilege? So that's interesting. A judge ruled that that if you're asking legal questions, like if you're saying, "What if I hid the money in the Cayman Islands?" to your Claude, that is discoverable. You have no protection for that. You have no expectation of protection. And then there's different levels of this. At big companies, what they're basically doing is they already have agreements with Google to say, treat my data that's on your Google servers as confidential. And Google agrees, they have that agreement, and they just extend that agreement to cover what people type into. The enterprise gets its own version of Gemini, and then what they type in there is covered by the same confidentiality. So that has a business contract level of confidentiality. It's probably discoverable by a court. But if you're Coca-Cola, you wouldn't type the secret formula of Coke into Gemini, because then some mid-level employee at Gemini could, in theory, find this and publicize it. So pharma companies have data that they don't want, that is cost them a great deal of money to acquire. They don't want anyone else to acquire that, possibly sell it to a competitor for any reason. They don't want it just to be available in two places. They want it to only be available in one place inside their four walls. And so they might set up an instance of something in-house rather than be willing to put it on someone else's servers outside of house. And then we all are familiar with getting a notice in the mail saying, some giant company that we trusted our data with, including our credit rating or our medical history with, is giving us notice that actually someone rated all of it.
I know it's funny how that's almost just become routine at this point, right? You sort of get the notification, we'll pay for Equifax or whatever it is for 2 years or something like that. And it's like,
And Thomas asks a question of, he's saying that he sees capital is more concentrated and impatient than ever, and that means that there's no room for angels funding truly novel ideas. Would you agree with that today, or no? What do you
I
think?
ask you about that, Steve. I don't know. Like, aren't you an angel investor and stuff?
So we have seen a sort of so I don't know if I agree with this, Thomas. We have seen a sort of a rebirth of investing just in AI. So there are a number of funds that are AI funds and industry AI funds, deep tech AI funds. And so, in fact, this has led to a remark that we're sort of in a K economy. And so if you can imagine, not, where people tied to AI are sort of featuring or experiencing generous fundraising environments and beliefs in high possible future revenue growth. And people who don't have that AI story, they may be in something very solid. They may have the protection of real estate values behind them, or they may have the protection of licensed professionals who are the supply of which isn't growing behind them, but they're just not getting the attention and love of investors. And and this gets to the question of, is this AI activity real? So you can have a financial bubble long before you have a real true payoff, a payoff in terms of, but what reality means is first there's utilization, then there's revenue growth, and finally there's profit. And if you don't get the real products with profit at the end, then everything up to that point was just a speculation and a bubble. And so, and we don't know for sure. We have massive spending on build out of AI, and interestingly, we're seeing massive utilization. OpenAI is making incredible claims of utilization. Claude is making incredible claims of utilization. But then is that going to convert to revenue? And then is that going to convert to profit? Intriguingly, the AI model doesn't have as great margins as other models. If Google search has incredible margins. Software publishing has incredible margins. SaaS has good margins. But does AI have great margins? We don't know. It's being sold at such a low price today, and we don't know what the final price is going to be. And so we don't know what AI's margins are going to be. So, and Jean-Luc says that updating your medical records to X saves identity thieves a step. Yeah, that's a good point, Jean-Luc. Also, now so any other thoughts on, so let me just cover a couple other things about valuation and fundraising. The IPO window is in theory open, and we had 15 plus IPOs last month, but digital health companies are not seeing a good time for IPOs. And so the window's open. There's 100 digital health unicorns out there that reach private market valuations of $1 billion, where private investors want them to IPO, and they're not going IPO. And that's very concerning. We want our friends who work there to have an exit. They usually work as cash salary below market with equity in addition, and they want them to go public and be able to harvest that equity. So we want investors to have good exits and then harvest the money and put it back in young digital health over again. And so now we have the IPO window was closed for a while the Fed was raising rates, and now the IPO window is open, and we're not seeing digital health companies IPOs. And the speculation I'm hearing is that to be sort of a hot, attractive IPO, you need to beat what's called the rule of 40. So the rule of 40 is something like your gross margin, simple gross margin plus top line growth rate together exceed the number 40. And so if you have gross margin of 20% and top line growth rate of 25%, that would get you to 45. That beats the number 40. That makes you attractive to IPO investors. So the speculation is that digital health companies that have been around 10 years, 15 years at this point, that they don't have good fundamentals. Maybe they're not growing fast because they stopped spending on growth during the period when interest rates rose rapidly, and they couldn't raise private funding and they couldn't spend on growth. So we're not sure, but the IPO window is open. So the last IPOs were Hinge Health in May of 2025, and Omada in June of 2025, and Heartflow. And since then, we've expected digital health IPOs. We haven't got them. There is a criticism of digital health in the capital markets that digital health has not had a lot of good exits. And that's a big problem because it means that new investors won't want to put new money into digital health if they see that it's a sector that doesn't have good exits. And so we want to break that stereotype. We want to have great exits, and we're not having great exits. So, and that's a big concern. So David, any thoughts on these topics?
No, I agree that it's dispiriting. And it's when you look at the past experience, it's been a huge amount of time where, like, you can say, well, because they've had some challenges, but are they less promising than some of these other companies? I mean, when you look at the incredible extravagant enthusiasm for just anything with AI in it right now, I mean, I think some of the digital health companies are likely to have more substance than just blah 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 plus AI. It's like the joke with the fortune cookie, right? It's used to say, oh, the way you make a fortune cookie interesting is you read the fortune cookie and then you say, oh, in bed. And now it's like blah 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 with AI, and it's like, oh, that's very interesting. So
Yeah. So what is up with digital health? So the way I view digital health very simply is that digital health is B2B, but in healthcare. That's the way to understand digital health. And then healthcare is 20% of the economy. So that makes it what? Like the whole rest of the economy is merely 80%. And so healthcare is one of the biggest possible actors, highly specialized vendors who specialize in health. Healthcare tends to demand vendors who specialize in healthcare. So it's unlikely IBM is going to be able to have a massive success moving organically into healthcare. It's unlikely that Samsung is going to have massive success moving organically into healthcare. It tends to reward vendors who grow up in healthcare.
to your
And
point, by the way, Steve, your exact point is what Bob Wachter in his wonderful new book, right, Giant Leap, where it's about AI and health, but it's also about technology and health. And he goes through like really bringing the receipts about the generations of healthcare of large companies that they're sort of like from IBM and everybody and even big like pharmacy companies. They're like, okay, well, how hard can this be? Or this we should be able to add this. Walmart, CVS. Everyone's going to add like the clinics and some healthcare component. And he just pointed out that it's been like for everybody. He views One Medical purchased by Amazon as like treading water. That's his quote. But he just thinks almost everything. And then obviously many of the startups don't work either. He goes through the example of Forward, for example. But then he's also talking about how just all these large companies, they just don't there's something that they don't appreciate or that doesn't they think they understand at a high level when they look at the numbers, but they're not really sort of getting the heart of it in some way. And then there's always a question as well, is that a permanent feature, or maybe with AI will somehow that be the great unlock? Do you have a thought on that?
so, first of all, if you work in tech, I think the healthcare market is a fabulous market for a number of reasons. The fact that healthcare centric young companies succeed in digital health and that outside conglomerates usually fail at organic growth in digital health is a good thing. If you're the little guy building a little company, you don't want to be wiped out by Samsung 5 years into your quest.
Noted.
And so that's a good thing. And then healthcare is just amazing. Healthcare is amazing for the following reasons. The first reason is that it's 20% of the economy. And the second reason is that it is the most information centric sector of the economy, more than aviation, more than energy. It's the most information centric sector of the economy. Third is that there's no limit to what people will spend on their health. And so, 20% is a floor, it's just going to go up as a percent of the economy from there at the expense of other sectors of the economy. So those are good reasons to go into digital health. Now, right now, there's a reputation that digital health software companies, aren't doing so well and that they have not been a lot of good exits. And I think that the way to think about this is that when you have a massive trend, it hits industries like a shock. And that allows the software company to grab a huge stake of importance in that sector. So when mobile hit, Uber was able to grab a huge stake of logistics as a logistics company. And then before mobile was software publishing model and databases might have been and so companies were able to grab a huge share. But in healthcare, it's so regulated. You look at there's so many insurance companies today. Will there be twice as many tomorrow, including a whole bunch of new entrant insurance companies? Probably not. You look at a city like St. Louis. How many major hospital systems are in St. Louis? Maybe there's four. Are there going to be eight in the future? Eight major hospitals? Probably not. With four of them being new, probably not. And so the incumbents managed to keep so an innovation shock throws the door open in a sector, but then in healthcare, that sector the door slams shut quickly. It didn't slam shut quickly for Uber. Uber was able to use software as a powerhouse to defeat logistics companies. But in healthcare, the door slams shut quickly. So the software companies can't figure out how to add enough value because you always need physicians with licenses in states to practice medicine and all the other regulated workers and regulated parts of the economy. And so it's just rare to see someone powered by software become some sort of massive new hospital chain or massive new medical practice chain or whatever. So that I think is the fundamental issue in healthcare services with why it hasn't looked like gaming or B2C or some of these other sectors.
And people talk about like the two sectors that are uncommonly resistant so far to new technologies. I guess three would be healthcare, education, and then string quartets, right? So you're thinking about like Bechamels's law, right? where it's sort of like it's as limited, it's like all dependent on people. And but it's interesting. I mean, there are, as you know, some of these interesting companies that are trying, actually using AI, whether thoughtfully or excessively. I discussed recently a company called Council Health that's trying to, so one example is, right, we could talk about later, but like is Council Health, where they're trying to say, okay, we're going to take what their view, they have a pretty dispiriting view of primary care. And their view is that there's not a lot of cognitive action going on from primary care doctors, which I think is tragic to have that perception. Then they say, well, even if there was, no one can access a primary care doctor, so it doesn't matter anyway. And then we're going to do a basic primary care visit, entirely have it done by AI, and tee it up for a human. At the end, the human will review the recommendation and okay it. So there's like nominally like a human in the loop, but their idea is that a human could essentially authorize 40 visits per hour at like $3 an hour. So I mean, that's sort of what they're talking about. So that would be a disruptive model, but it's sort of like a very different conception of medicine. And Walker, what he thinks is going to happen is he thinks that you're going to wind up with essentially a two-tiered system where there's going to be one tier that's, essentially highly AI enabled, where he thinks it's going to be sort of like tax preparation, actually, where, for most people, they'll have simple stuff and they'll be able to use, like some tax software or whatever. But then people who have more complexity going on and who can afford it are going to have an accountant. And he thinks that that's sort of the way, healthcare is going to go, where a lot of this AI stuff will be useful and will be used to provide people something better than nothing. But that is going to be this sort of level of, sort of denser care, with probably like an element of concierge.
Really interesting. Thanks. And we have some great questions in the chat, and we have some great sections of the show. I'm actually going to start skipping some of the sections of the show just because we want to start the second half on time. So let's see. Have any reports come out in the last few weeks that really you thought the findings were so important you think it's worth bringing to our audience today?
I don't know about reports. I mean, it's more like they're interesting papers here. And there was an interesting paper just today from a group at Google and at AI and at Google and at the Beth Israel. Adam Rodman has done some fabulous work, basically sort of examining how a tool that they've developed, this sort of AI diagnostic tool, how that both compares to physicians and, I think much more interestingly, how it can enhance a person's visit with the physician. In fact, they were saying that actually, it helps workflow and that sort of thing. I mean, what's interesting about some of the Google stuff is apparently, at least in the previous generation of work, it was David Feinberg when he was head of Google Health. According to Walker's book, again, read the book. It's a great book, but I'm not getting paid for it. What he was told to do was to, do interesting stuff. Don't get us in trouble. Like basically, like don't F with cloud and everything else. So it's sort of like they know that everything Google does is like everyone goes nuts about. So they were like, just basically, be good, but not out of a deeper mission to be good. Although I think the people on the Google Health team are incredibly, and invariably, frankly, are incredibly impassioned, really want to do good. But I think they don't really want to get them in trouble. And they know health is so sensitive that they see it more as an interesting opportunity to explore AI. And, and they have really interesting papers. The papers are sort of much more revealing than papers from like other AI companies, because I think they're working a lot more collaboratively with the community.
Really interesting. Thanks. So the next question is just, what is a technology or a use of GenAI that has improved your life? And so I'll throw out one thing here, which is that I have switched from Google Search to Google Gemini for everything. That's why I almost never use search anymore. I use search when I want to find out someone's true URL for their website, and search is faster for that. And then I use Gemini for everything else. And you can actually, if a lot of you like me have, say, Chrome browser, and you have a URL bar at the top, but it's a combined search and URL browser at the top, you can actually change that to point to a GenAI LLM instead of pointing to a search engine. And then so that's one thing I'll mention. And then a second one is I'm trying to do more talking to my AI. So you're on your phone, your AI apps have a mode that is native talking, and it's fast back and forth talking.
It's
And I'm trying to,
fantastic, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
I mean, I think what it really has done, it's screwed Alexa and Siri because when you're it's so good that like the Chat GPT, the voice interaction mode. Like sometimes I'll be in the car, right? And you have some question or whatever. And it's just, I mean, it could be a random thing, some Red Sox question or some deep question about, some Bismol or anything in between. And you want the answer and you're just chatting with it and it sort of gives it to you and then you can ask it follow up and it's I mean, I absolutely can see why people are so excited about that kind of, interacting by voice because it's so direct. And plus, if you're like not, if you're like not 8 years old, your fingers are generally too big for for at least for like the iPhone anyway. And you're always like hitting the wrong keys and stuff. I do. So it's kind of just so much more efficient, which I appreciate. I think the chatbot stuff I think Claude is just, everyone I know is using Claude. It's just like, boom, it's just, I mean, I actually saw, I think, again, in his book, Bob thanks Claude, or at least mentions Claude, like, no, Claude didn't write his book. You couldn't write his book, it's all his experiences. But I think that it sort of is probably a good brainstormer and a good editor and sort of highlighted certain points. And hopefully it'll make LinkedIn less tedious and people will stop using all these like open AI searches where it's not A, it's B, where like these incredibly tedious, LinkedIn posts that are obviously just cribbed directly from OpenAI, and maybe the quality of engagement will increase.
So we have a question from Thomas about will Apple win the AI wars because they have the distribution for increasingly cheaper AI? So really interesting question. It's kind of an observation, and it's framed as almost a joke, which is that Apple, first of all, Siri was always supposed to be an AI play, and that preceded the modern large language models, and Siri failed to do what people expected it to do. And then Apple had an effort to build their own proprietary large language model. That failed, and they backed up Siri and Apple Intelligence with OpenAI. And now their internal effort continues to fail, and they've just signed a new contract to be backstopped by Google Gemini instead of OpenAI. Meanwhile, all of Apple's hardware products are sold out across the country because everyone's buying a Mac Mini or a Mac Studio or a MacBook Pro for their ability to. I think one of the key issues is that their central Apple Silicon chips have a very powerful CPU, a very powerful GPU, and then shared memory. And they're the first people to pioneer shared memory, which means when the GPU needs to use the one memory, it uses the one memory. And when the CPU needs to use it, they use it. And you're not sending stuff back and forth, which turns out to be very useful you don't need a lot of power to run an agent on your machine, but you need a lot of power to run a local model. And so the irony is that Apple has gone from one pratfall to another pratfall in AI. And suddenly, by accident, its software architecture is the best, and it's also the preferred purchase. If a software person could choose, they'd rather choose an Apple device for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah,
So
they
I
failed
think
forward. You were saying they sort of failed forward brilliantly. And what you're describing, and particularly the ability to use like Cursor and some of these tools on it, is exactly what I think is driving this sort of interest. I mean, you mentioned I started a new role recently, and it was like the considerations for a new, for like a work computer were exactly the ones that you were just mentioning. So you're absolutely on the pulse here.
so. To finish up our prior question, any technology or use of GenAI that's improved your life that you want to share with our audience?
Well, I do think I like the brainstorming I mean, just having that capability. It's, I mean, if you're like a naturally curious person and my kids accuse me of being, it's like, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or just anything. And you're trying to learn more, you hear about something, or you're trying to remember something, or you have an association, you just can get anything. And, I mean, I remember a few, what's his name? The guy from Benchmark, right? Was essentially telling students at some graduation that like right now this was like pre-AI. He was like, you can find anything you want on the internet right now. Like this is the best time to be alive, and that you can just go and find things and make yourself an expert and nearly like top level expert in anything just by investing in available resources. And if that was true, like pre-AI, now it's just incredible, right? Like, you're able to, again, not real expertise. I think that there's something experiential, which you don't get from, it's sort of maybe the perception of expertise. but in a lot of cases, to sort of at least get familiar, you have a conversation coming up, or you have a you're just trying to like talking about British mysteries with my dad or something. I'm trying to figure out, oh, what are new series or what might we both like? I'll sort of, well, I've done the search too, and we'll try to find something that we'll both enjoy together, that kind of thing. So it's I just feel like it's like an always available, incredibly powerful, really helpful resource that uh once I guess that I'm just amazed it's not used more often by more people, because it's just even as a silly little chatbot, it's incredibly useful. But maybe it's like more for a knowledge worker thing, or if your like thing is like reflecting on issues and brainstorming and trying to understand complicated issues, it's really helpful to be able to brainstorm. I can't figure. It's probably saved the rest of my family a lot of grief of me saying, "Oh, what about this or what about this?" They're like, "Here, talk to the AI and let us know what you think."
And Jen asks, how do you think the relative deregulation at the FDA will help digital health startups? So, Jen, that's a great question for each of us. So, first of all, if you go back 15 years, I think the FDA had a fearsome reputation for blocking innovation. And what people said about them was that they took protecting the patient to such an extreme that it hurt patients through lack of innovation. But then I would say, starting about 10 years ago, for digital health, especially for software as a medical device and for prescription digital therapeutics and for digital health, there has been quite a positive, open-minded view of the FDA, and they have been supportive of regulations of companies that have new chips, new data, new AI, new analytics in their products. As I would call the FDA relatively supportive. Now, more recently, there's been some deregulation, and I would say that short-term, that could be good for digital health, but medium to long-term regulation that keeps everyone honest and truthful, that keeps discoveries proven and keeps everyone honest and truthful, and prevents sort of excessive selling, is a good thing for the industry. We want there to be clinical grade, and we want there to be consumer grade, and we want clinical grade to be more expensive, more proven to truly work. And clinical grade, maybe there's some wiggle room there, and we don't want a world of sort of oversold supplements. That has the potential to truly undermine medicine, that world, if it turns out that they don't do what they say they do.
So a couple of comments on that. Generally, like largely in agreement, violent agreement. I think that at the FDA, there was great work from Scott Gottlieb and also from Amy Abernathy, when she was deputy commissioner, in advancing sort of a framework that would sort of allow for more trust and to try to enable more technology to advance from sort of like demonstrably trusted partners, but still with a degree of like their validation. I think, for example, what's really annoyed people is, okay, even if you want to use like some software to detect, let's say, various malignancies in the lung or various abnormalities for using AI, you have to run all this validation for each individual, at least until recently. And I don't know what the current status is, but I knew like, and again, Bob talked about this in his book about how you have to go through each and every indication and go through a whole procedure to prove each of one of those things. But then again, you could say, well, just because you can do something for something that's really common, maybe for something that's much more rare, you actually won't be as accurate. And that's really critical to understand. So it just is sort of the way you think about drugs isn't always right for how you think about, sort of AI. And there is going to sort of need to be more flexible, more imagination. I think what you have to appreciate is even whatever you're hearing at the top level, like I remember Scott would be up there when we'd be talking absolutely authentically about sort of a more, sort of a more flexible and more thoughtful approach. Then you get into deep into the organization, and the combination of the actual people who are doing the regulating might be a little bit more conservative at the time than you're hearing. I mean, this is true not just for AI, it's true for every level, where people on the one hand might say, oh, we need to be more flexible, we need to be more understanding. There's a lot of concern about being excessive. There's a lot of conservativeness, small c, within an agency. And then on top of that, within companies, it's absolutely insane. Like large pharma companies, every level within an organization, someone will say, oh, well, I saw an example of that. So out of an abundance of caution, out of an abundance of caution, an abundance of caution. And then by the end of the day, you're so abundantly cautious that you don't do shit or anything that's that interesting. And then it's sort of like, oh, so it's not like entirely an FDA thing. but you need people who are in organizations who are going to constructively engage with the FDA. And you also need a posture at the FDA that permits thoughtful engagement and that isn't sort of like just sort of intellectually overreactive, let's say. We'll go with that.
Yeah. So now we're going to move on to another section, which is upcoming conferences. So I'll just mention HIMSS is going on right now. HIMSS is the National Annual Conference of Hospital CIOs, and it's taken on a larger role over time. It's become the conference of many kinds of providers, everyone who works in the hospital CIO office, also the hospital CFO office often go to HIMSS. Also, many payers also go to HIMSS. And so that's going on right now, March 9th to 12th. And I followed some news about HIMSS. That's in Las Vegas. It's a giant conference. It's tens of thousands of people. It used to be very closely watched, especially during the EMR boom. And it seems like every session topic there has to do with AI. And so this seems to be the year of AI in conferences that we're witnessing. And so that's HIMSS happening right now. And then there's the Digital Health Innovation Summit coming up, late April in Boston. So this is really interesting. This is an independent investor conference, and it's focused primarily at, I'd call it like Series B to C type digital health companies. It used to be focused earlier stage, but it's rare to have a good investor conference in digital health. This is a great one. It also takes place several months after JP Morgan in January in Las Vegas. And so a lot of the East Coast VC investors like to come here, and Boston also has a bunch themselves. And so this is a kind of a summit for our audience who are young company leaders and investors. This is one worth going to. This is the East Coast's JP Morgan, basically. It's an independent, it's not owned by a sell side investment bank. And so if I were a young company, I would, I would write VCs I know who are based in Boston, New York. You could expand that a little bit wider to include Chicago, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and just say, I'm going to this conference, I'd like to meet there. And so that's, and then also if they're Boston VCs, you can spend an extra day and say, I'm in town in Boston, the day before or the day after this conference, let's meet up in Boston. So this is a good chance to use a conference that many are likely attending as a forcing factor, and they're available for meetings. They'll be there, you'll be there. And then that's, another conference coming up. So David, any conferences that you're following that you
I
recommend
think
our
that's good
audience
advice,
look at?
really good advice you're giving to young companies there. I'm mostly I'm kind of doing it. I'm kind of heads down really with my work at the moment, but I am speaking next week at a nice, it's like, I think it's called the Thrive Summit, Thrive Conference in Phoenix that Personify Health puts on. And they're doing a very nice job with it. And predictably talking about importance of agency and health. But it's, a lot of uplift with that conference and thoughtful speakers. Uh, I think it's a different kind of conference than what you're talking about, obviously. For what it's trying to do, I think it's nicely organized and it should be fun.
That's great. And so that's both a conference for people to look into. That's March 16th to 19th in Phoenix, the Thrive Summit sponsored by Personify Health. And it's also a personal notice because you'll be there. And for our audience, you can reach out to David if you're going to that conference and see if you can meet with him. And then this merges with our personal notices section. So my personal notice is that our next show is coming up on Wednesday, March 20th at 4 p.m. And it's with Mishalak, who's the chairman of Personify Health. That's a coincidence. I didn't know that you were the week before that, going to be speaking at his conference. And we're talking about consolidation in the employer health tech sector. So employer health tech, that's companies like Personify, also Teladoc, also Omada, also Hinge Health, also Accolade, which is now owned by Transcarent. And so these are companies that sell health solutions into the benefit leader of the progressive large employer. And that sector has had massive over entry for the past 15 plus years. And we're seeing a long expected cycle of consolidation in that sector. So we're going to talk about how that's playing out.
I look forward to that. That'll be interesting. That's great.
Thank you. Any other personal notices on your part, David?
What? No, no, but I appreciated hearing about yours though. That was good.
That's great. So now we're going to shift to the second half of our show. So from GenAI to patient agency in healthcare, using AI to improve outcomes by driving agency and behavior change. So very topical. I've heard a number of VCs talking about how they're looking at this question of can you affect the front office of care or the patient experience? by using GenAI. But we're going to talk more broadly about innovation and your career history as well. So I just wanted to first bring up that in your career you've been in medical informatics in academia, but you were also a pharma executive, and so you joined Merck in a group that revolving around the DPP-4 inhibitor Januvia. Can you tell us the story of that?
Yeah. That's no, it was fun. I mean, actually, it's funny. Like growing up, I never thought I was going to be do anything but academia, and then having experience all this, more or less, because I was doing some stem cell research and got to moonlight at a venture fund, and then all of a sudden, I saw like the expression of people really translating the science into very pragmatic application, and it was really entrepreneurs, and it was the private sector that was in close collaboration with academics who were doing it. To me, it was just like, oh, that was magic. So now whenever I was fortunate enough to join a great group at Merck that was doing called experimental medicine. But what was funny about it, which like sort of in retrospect was, so this was a group that was sort of really catalyzed by Merck that was trying to develop a diabetes medicine that became Januvia. It was like DPP, it's called DPP-4 inhibitor. But the thing about it was they started pursuing it after a competitor, after Novartis started developing a DPP-4 inhibitor, and they sort of were able to catch up and ultimately like launch beforehand. So in the way they historicized it was, well, because we used biomarkers in a particular way and were very innovative, we were able to pick up all these years of development and zip ahead. And it's fun. And the reason I kind of think that's so interesting to talk about is, on the one hand, they were innovative, and they use some biomarkers, also biomarkers that are definitely addressable. But the way that success, to me, what I think is interesting about it for listeners, viewers, is the way we tend to, and large companies tend to, the tidy narratives that are created around successes. Successes are often, in reality, they tend to be based on a slew of circumstances. In this case, the Novartis drug had some issues with it. It was also twice a day instead of once a day. There were all sorts of other issues. But in the scheme of it, it was no, the whole success of this was crystallized to biomarkers. And then it became, biomarkers for everything. So it was like, here, every drug now needs a biomarker and a whole bunch of stuff. And obviously, if you have a compelling biomarker, it helps. It really does. But the idea of like instilling or insisting on biomarkers for everything, and I think that's a pattern in many companies where sort of things succeed for a combination of complex reasons. It's distilled into a tidy success narrative, and then it becomes that sort of a linchpin of whatever one decides was driving it. And then people are like, oh, that's the key for everything. And then that's sort of, then initiated across the company. And it's never, like in some cases, then ultimately, I mean, it was a very smart, amazing, I mean, I was privileged to be part of it, incredible group of people, but like some things were really suitable for biomarkers. A whole bunch of stuff wasn't. And the thing was, to have a validated biomarker, validated system was in many cases as much work as actually developing the drug itself. So it was sort of like, in theory, it was a good idea. And if there happened to be one available, and I think, obviously many disease foundations are increasingly recognizing the value of having validated biomarkers to accelerate research into the condition of greatest interest. But the idea that, okay, well, we're just going to pull one off the shelf and pretty good, we'll just sort of validate it this week and then put in the study next week, isn't really, anything like how science works.
Thanks. And then Keytruda, from a success story that you've written about, what were your learnings from your work on or your study of Keytruda?
So again, Keytruda wasn't a product that I developed, but it's sort of, obviously, it's like biggest. When I was at Merck, actually, it's kind of right before this, and like their oncology was like HDAC inhibitors. I mean, it was really just sort of like not a lot going on. And it was, so it was sort of funny that now they're sort of known for their oncology work. But what was really interesting, so the company, and this is not unusual, so the way Keytruda developed, it started off as so right now it's sort of like it enhances the immune response against tumors. Initially, it was it was a small group at a company that more or less makes paints. Or the broader company makes paints, and then they were trying to make but they had like some people that it also had a biotech group, and they were trying to look for things that would actually block autoimmune, so sort of turn down the immune system. And instead of finding that, they found antibodies that did the opposite. But then this company was bought by Sharing Plow. So then it was like, oh shit, we better make sure we don't get then they fought to keep the program alive, and they sort of barely just sort of did. And then it moved along a little bit. They were developing it for oncology. And then the company was acquired by Merck. And then Merck was like, oh, this is shit. We're like this, we don't see any value in this at all. And they were all set to, they had a term sheet, and they were like on the edge, really on the edge of like a week away from like out licensing it. And then a competitor showed, and then there was like a interesting study using a similar mechanism from BMS at the time. And then they were like, oh, maybe we should have another look at this. And then it turned out that it was actually more interesting than they thought. So, but and developed it deliberately. It was like an impassioned team of people who had kept it going at 3 different companies, despite a lot of skepticism, a lot of lack of belief. Now, what Merck did do well is once they did see that it had potential, this is starting with Peter Kim and then later Roger Perlmutter, then they were like all in. Speaking of all in, they were like, okay, wow, this is really something significant. Like, let's not screw around. Let's just devote all resources. Like, this could change everything. So they either had the foresight or the good fortune to recognize that, and you don't know which it is really, that, I mean, it could be they had no other alternative. So like, you might as well bet on the one thing you might have, and it turned out to work. But it was, watching it develop is so interesting because, the way things are services. And like, just one other quick example, you could say, one of the big companies right now in Kendall Square in Boston here, right, is Takeda. And Takeda's here because they bought a company called Millennium Pharmaceuticals, and they bought Millennium for their oncology products. But the reason Millennium itself had oncology products was they were doing all this like, genetic stuff that was like sexy for pharma companies, and they were getting paid for it, but they didn't really have any drugs. So then they went off and bought a company called Leukocyte in Princeton, and they bought it for a compound called Campound that was later sort of like out licensed to Genzyme. And they didn't even know that they had in their early research this compound that would wind up being this sort of proteasome inhibitor and being this massive oncology drug. So here it is. So this company, they bought a company like Millennium Pharmaceuticals, started to do sexy genetics. They took the money, which is kind of what I think a lot of AI companies are doing now. They're getting all the money that they're being given and, for selling the sexy story. And they're doing what in some cases just seems to me very basic, like in-license something, take it through a development stage, and then try to out-license it. And they have enough money that they can do it on enough compounds that something may work. And they're bringing in people who have like, hopefully some good taste and be able to do that. And then it'll be like, oh, AI did this. But it's a little bit like, like the stone soup thing. It's like, yeah, like AI plus a lot of compounds and some good judgment here. So here it was really funny how they wound up as this, success story. Millennium's exit to Takeda was entirely from this oncology drug that when they acquired Leukocyte explicitly for a pipeline, they had no idea they even had it. So it's kind of really shows you how hard it is to predict innovation, at least in pharma.
So you've talked about how innovation actually works versus the idealized way we think innovation works. Can you tell us about the gap? How does innovation actually work?
Right. So this isn't sort of like the answer to innovation is what I really like is the Carlotta Perez model of sort of like the life cycle of innovation. And what by that, so 2 different points I think come out of like my understanding of this. One is that people have an idea that, oh, here comes some new technology and then boom, everything's great. And that isn't how it works generally. Like it just isn't. Something comes along and then basically it takes a very, very, very long time. It's sort of like she describes this early phase as like a frenzy because people are trying to get their arms around the technology. They're trying to figure out what does it even mean? How can you use it? But it doesn't really help anyone be productive quite yet. They're still trying to figure it out. And you need for something to actually translate into productivity, you have to go through all sorts of serial innovations and tweaks and all sorts of incremental improvements. I mean, another example is from like the transportation industry, where when there was something new that came along, like a new bus or a new something, it wasn't immediately have an impact. There were all sorts of micro innovations along the way that are required before years later. So this is sometimes sort of 2 points from this. One, this is sort of manifested as the productivity paradox, where it's sort of like, oh, if everything's so full of tech, how come we're not seeing the productivity numbers? And a lot of times it takes a lot longer to materialize. And then the second thing is, I think people forget how just it's not like there's something comes along and then boom, life's better. There's an incredible need for incremental innovation, and then for people who are described as lead users, people who are kind of willing to screw around with imperfect technology and try to get it to work a little bit better, and to do those, and to work with it over time. So I think we have a little bit of these extravagant expectations for new tech of any kind, where it's like, here's some, I mean, you can say you saw it for stem cells. You can say you saw it for the genome, right? You look at the quote when the genome was first sequenced, and people were like, oh, if only the genome was sequenced, we'll know what it is to be alive. And then it was so extensive that actually Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin wrote this famous piece for the New York Review of Books called, I Dream of Genome, where he essentially said these people are turning DNA into a fetish object. They're sort of like imbuing it with all sorts of like magical powers, and it's just out of control. And so I think that that has to be guarded against as well.
So the next topic is AI in drug development. And so what we've seen recently is we've seen sort of I'd say almost a bubble of young software companies trying to figure out ways to do better modeling in silico of drug candidates, better modeling in silico of drug targets, better modeling in silico of the drug and of the blood environment. And that has and pharma, and what they're trying to do is sell to pharma, and then pharma has had a mixed reaction to this innovation coming at them. But there's a broader issue of just will this be successful? Will AI, and it's not necessarily large language model AI if you're talking about modeling the interaction of molecules, but will AI, does AI in silico have something to offer the drug development process? So can you tell us what you're thinking about that?
Yeah. So this is topic, obviously, it really comes up a lot. I've seen a lot of pharma sort of executives wrestle with this. And typically people go to Davos and go, AI for everything. It's awesome. And then like they show up more privately and they're like, except to his credit, the CEO of Novartis, Voss, sort of spoke this this group at Harvard Business School. I'm an advisor to, and was sort of talking about how there was like a meeting where people say, okay, well, do you expect it to impact either your top or bottom line in the next 5 to 10 years? And he was saying some conference he was at, I think, of other pharma executives, and basically people were like, but on the other hand, like it is helping with some processes. Now, I think the real thing we'd like to be able to do, just like you're saying, I mean, there are god awful diseases out there. Alzheimer's is horrible, pancreatic cancer, GBM, no shortage of horrible conditions that we all need to, all sorts of rare diseases that we owe it to the patients to bring to bear the most effective technologies we possibly can in the most useful way possible. I think where biological data makes it, there are properties of it that make it really hard. And just to get full credit, there's a paper that I'm working, that usual paper publication process where it's sort of like endless reviews and iterations with like the key author was Andreas Bender, and also Jack Scattle is an author of like eRoom fame. But we sort of were and other collaborators as well. We are sort of discussing, well, why is AI like feels like it's being oversold a little bit? And their property, one of the things that we came up with was there's these properties of biological data that are really more difficult than people appreciate. And one is scarcity. Like you're saying, oh my gosh, there's so much data. Yes, there are, but there's statistically few endpoints that you really care about. Like the clinical trial results you really care about, not that many of them. Or you want to sort of base it on like approved drugs. Not that many drugs were actually approved. There are tons of ligands, but not that many approved drugs. So it's like, it's kind of hard to model when the actual endpoints that you have that you care about are relatively few. Second, the data are unbearably fragile. So we like to be able to, like, if you're, for a lot of the work on, with deep language, you were able to, people were like, okay, this is a cat, this is not a cat, 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 not cat, not cat. Okay, fine. But it doesn't work as well for a lot of biological data. Like if you want to say, this drug works or this drug binds. Well, that's incredibly conditional. Like maybe it does, maybe it doesn't under some circumstances in some patients with some conditions, with some huge number of other contingencies. So it's not as categorical as like cat or not cat. So it's harder to really sort of even label it accurate, in a meaningful way. And then third is opacity, and I'm just saving you the grief of having to say epistemic opacity, which is the fact that the data that you actually have in hand is, if you have like this sort of data from like cells and all this stuff, that's still so far away from the outcome that you care about. And you don't really know the pathways in most cases to what leads from the data you have in hand to the outcome. I mean, if the data that you have in hand is really good proxy data, then yeah, you could say, okay, well, it's fine. I know what it's going to do. But otherwise, it's so far from it that it's kind of hard to generalize, and that's a real problem. Now, I mean, a worked example of so what happens is what tends to be in a lot of this AI in biopharma is you have these models that function beautifully in a hermetic setting. In isolation, they work really well, but then you plug them into an actual real biological, a real pharma process where you're trying to use it at some stage in the drug development process. And it sort of is like, like doesn't necessarily add value. And the best way to think about this has been a worked example of, I mean, how and also it was solved in healthcare AI with there was an algorithm for sepsis, and this is really, really, really elegant. Like, if I can remember the name of the author, Suchi Saria, where the way it worked was they developed an algorithm that's going to predict what patients are going to in a hospital based on other criteria are going to likely have sepsis, and to try to treat them proactively, which would be really helpful. It's a terrible and happens really fast. So if you're able to do something early, you can have better outcomes. That was the idea. They had a model. It was great. It was a good model. It was trained in theory. You put it in practice. First of all, in different hospitals, it didn't work as well. Then there was all sorts of like model drift and all sorts of issues. And then there were all sorts of implementation problems where when people were actually doing it, people in real life behave different than like the theoretical responses that you might have have your model obey. So there had to do and she wrote a wonderful like Nature, I think it was a Nature Medicine paper on this that described what it actually took to go from this nice algorithm that and it ultimately proved to be helpful in some things. And also, of course, I'm going to tell you Bob Wachter wrote about this in his book. But like, what it took to actually get it to work. And so I think that like the example of really recognizing that an algorithm for it to be useful for pharma, you have to kind of understand it in its native environment, how it's going to be used, not like in an academic setting, it can be a 6 out of 10 where it's sort of, you get all sorts of kudos from, and you get published in a journal. But if you're really trying to help make, develop drugs faster, it really needs a little bit more fit for purpose.
And thank you. And for our audience, now is the time to throw in your questions for David in the chat. So my whole career, there's been, I think, technologists have been attempting to boost patient engagement, patient adherence, patient education, and yet at the same, and it's also essential. You think that providers can go so far, a drug can go so far, but patients have a significant amount to do themselves. They have to adhere to a post-operation protocol. They need to take a drug that they are supposed to take for their condition. And patient engagement rates and patient adherence rates are surprisingly low, and that I remember when I believed that the smartphone was going to change all that, because the smartphone is always on, always up to date, always connected, always personalized. It can alarm, it can be social, it can be gamified, it can tie you into your care. And patient engagement, now most people have smartphones, and it hasn't really boosted, even though it's easy to get an app that gives you alarms when you're supposed to take your drugs. And that hasn't really, I think, meaningfully boosted patient adherence to medication schedules, which is too bad. But you've talked about, and so that's a mystery of how do we engage patients in our care. In fact,
just to respond to that, the attraction of the smartphone. So actually, Eric Topol, one of his earlier books, I remember reviewing it, was "The Patient Will See You Now," and his thesis of it, as I'm recalling, was that the phone was going to be the great unlock, and it was going to sort of be the great democratizer. It was going to be like the printing press. And he was really, really enthusiastic about it. It didn't quite achieve the unlock that he was sort of hoping for, appropriately, wanting to have happen. And it did. I think the people who've done a lot of these digital apps, the decay rate of utilization is just crazy, right? Like it just goes down so much. And it reminds me of one of the it's really hard to change behavior is essentially one of the important points. There's so much work on this. And I think it's not just, oh, can you pick up the app? But I think people use things when they really find it useful on a daily basis. So like giving people badges or little cutesy things, which is what people try to do at some point, I think gets you not very far. Because on the other hand, like look at like you do use your like look how many apps on your iPhone you probably have been using, like Spotify, my guess is, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it is, like you probably use it all the time because it just when things deliver a palpable benefit, you use them more often. And like every company I've been in, I've always been trying that. It's always like been my theme to like, okay, well, how can we get this more useful? What's the answer? The answer is like to try, like the reason people would use Google search wasn't because of like some affection for Google, is because like you type a question and an answer shows up. Or for Uber, it's not that people love the company necessarily, but it's like, you press a button and a car shows up. It's pretty amazing. So I think having something that delivers continues to deliver a palpable benefit is sort of what drives utilization. Whereas all of these other sort of like gamifications, and particularly for health, like life is complicated. And I just don't think these sort of like cutesy gamifications get you.
And there's a sort of a joke or funny statement in healthcare, which is that America's drug problem is that Americans take drugs they're not supposed to take. But then America's other drug problem is that Americans don't take drugs they're supposed to take. And
Like a
America,
non-adherence. I wrote about this for the Times at one point, for the cases column about just what a large problem non-adherence is. I mean, people who have cancer, many people with, and this is separate from the affordability problem, which is a problem as well. Like if you can't afford to buy medicine, then obviously you're not going to take it. But there are plenty of examples where people, they have the medicines, they just aren't motivated or they don't like, or that's not consonant with their lifestyle. And it was a really big issue for things like with HIV, because even with like now the regimens are so good that you don't have to remember it that as often. I don't believe. I think the medicines, regimens are much simplified, but it was a real concern because you had these regimens that people needed to take. And if they just missed one or two doses, you could then wind up um, sort of like developing these resistant strains that then would no longer be resistant to the medicines that you were on. So like you really couldn't afford to even miss a day or two, and that's pretty demanding. So it's I'm resonating with it. Like it's a real challenge. Like from doctors are sort of like take this is the most important thing, and people are like, well, actually, I'm kind of busy with my life at the moment, so trying to figure out how to make all that work.
well, so now, mobile was supposed to offer the solution to patient education, patient engagement, patient adherence, and it's helped in some ways. It has not really lifted adherence rates as much as we would have liked. Now there's a question about AI, generative AI. Does generative AI, can that empower the patient and get engagement by the patient and participatory medicine between patient and physician, and empower the physician to help train agency and adherence in the patient? What do you think is going to be the impact of Gen AI on patient agency, patient outcomes?
Well, I think that the opportunity to help people build agency is critically important. And obviously, like that is what Laura's trying to do. That's what I'm sure other folks are looking at as well. I think one of the things that I think may be less effective is people are sort of like, there's a view that AI will be good for what ails you. And that if we can just provide more precision in terms of the advice, that's going to be the answer. And so this takes me back a little bit to the sort of the whole quantified self movement, right? So it was the idea that quantified self became a big thing. People were going to measure everything. You remember the example of the guy at Stanford and the narcissism and all that. And he's approached it like to his credit, he's approached it scientifically. He's a great guy, and it's been really interesting. But like as a generalized approach, it was so bad that Chris Anderson, who was the editor of Wired at the time, wrote this very famous tweet like 2015, where he goes, measure everything, I haven't got anything of value from it. Like having all this measurement hasn't really helped. And I think it's really important to distinguish, like in many cases, the advice that you need it's not like hyper precise in terms of like what the AI is. Sorry, at the moment, it seems like it's trying to offer like all this, oh, I'm going to give you precision nutrition advice, or I'm going to give you precision, I mean, remember back a generation, like the previous revolution was genetics. It was, we're going to give you precision wine advice. It's all this bullshit. And the idea is that, the basics of what you should eat is not necessarily, for most people, is not necessarily that complicated. Kevin Hall, who has this great book, Food Intelligence, describes a study, a pretty rigorous study he did of like CGMs for non-diabetics. CGMs critically important for diabetics, absolutely transformative, full stop. CGMs for non-diabetics, I know is in the news lately, but in the published studies that he did, he basically sort of found that they were so unreliable from one location to the other location, like depending on where you had them on your body, depending on like the same food he was doing in this NIH in a clinical trial environment, like almost essentially like a bomb calorimeter where they would sort of have everything measured to the like microcalorie. And it was just incredible variation for the same food on different days. So he was basically saying like it wasn't that predictive at all. And that it wasn't, and all these companies that were sort of offering these sort of hyper detailed advice weren't ultimately telling you more than that you would get from, like avoid calorie, his basic advice is like avoid calorie dense food, hyper palatable calorie dense food, and generally like Mediterranean diet's good for you-ish. And like, and like it's just kind of like basic, but like then, it's people come up with make it way more complicated than it needs to be, as if, by having this. Now, the one advantage to this type of precision is, and this is kind of really interesting from a digital health perspective, is when it connects with your explanatory model. So there's sort of this professor at Harvard who was sort of a psychologist and anthropologist who did this great work on like the way we understand diseases through our models of it, like how we explain it. And you kind of need to understand how a patient, what their explanatory model is to figure out kind of what's the right, most effective way to engage with them. So the example I always think about was Francis Collins, who, head of the, he was one of the two people who sequenced the genome. I had the NIH, all sorts of, I think, but all sorts of stuff, right? A very big human geneticist. And then he did some press conference once with precision medicine, and he's saying, "Oh yeah, I looked at my sequence, and it turns out I have some risk factor gene for diabetes, and that made me like eat carefully and exercise." And it's like, okay, like I'm like, and the point is, he should be eating carefully and he should be exercising, independent of what one gene or another, in most cases, that's going to modestly inflect his risk one way or another, and probably impact his risk way less than like 90 other factors. But for him, because he's a geneticist in theory, he is a geneticist, like to him, the fact that, I mean, I don't know how convinced he was. Well, he said he was convinced. So for him, the fact that the gene said you need to up your game for diabetes prevention was what motivated him. For a different person, it could have been, it was your microbiome that told you to do, and for someone else, it could have been something else. So I do think that some of that may be getting the motivation, but I don't think it is exactly the precision. On the other hand, I think if to the extent AI can help cultivate and bring out people's intrinsic motivation and ability to recognize their incredible capability that we all have to make a difference in the world and to shape our future and to help guide us thoughtfully when we're experiencing challenges, to help us identify wins, to figure out why we had those wins, and to sort of help us be more successful in the future so that we approach future challenges more constructively, that we stick, when you talk to, when you read Martin Seligman, who's talking about what's the value of agency, he has like some magic reason. He goes, basically, if you're more agenic, essentially you effing try harder. You just stick with it longer. You're more persistent. And that ultimately allows you to be successful. Now, on the stick with it part, like you can stick with it all you want. You're not going to probably run a 4-minute mile. So like there are things you might not want to stick with. But on balance, I think sticking with things is, can help you be healthier, and being engaged enough in things you want to stick with and having those, sort of those capabilities also help you to be more fulfilled and more engaged, and to interact with and to connect with other people in a more fulfilling way. And so you sort of are able to live a more flourishing life.
Great, thank you. And Thomas in our audience asks, can you tell us about why you joined Lore Health?
Well, it was funny. It was, I don't know who Tom is. It sounds like it would be, if I had been thoughtful enough to plant a question, I probably would have planted that once, but I didn't. So for the last several years, I've been essentially developing this broader view of health. It was really kind of annoying me that people were that there got to be this. So let me take one step back. All right. I think as all of us get older, we're obviously more conscious of aging. There are mentors and family members who age, and we all see that. At the same time, the science of aging is developed and evolved incredibly productively. So I don't mean the rejuvenation pods and the young blood stuff. I mean, no, but like the actual geroscience and the real science of it has really made exciting progress. And one of the real things you start to look at is there's a huge amount of impact from just basic lifestyle things that you never, that you might have underappreciated. So the role of exercise, the role of recovery, sleep and recovery, unbelievably important. Um, Role of nutrition, right? And so all of those things just sort of like, well, gosh, that's really important. But it isn't like, I think people have, because we apply tech to so many areas of our life, that mindset sort of has taken over our approach to some people's approach to health and have turned what should be trying to live a more flourishing, more capacious life. Instead, it's become this sort of relentless exercise in brutal optimization. Like, okay, you have to get exactly the right food, exactly the right, what's your VO2? How can you optimize it? What's your biological age this moment? And I've pleaded with some of these companies from Whoop to Peloton to try to step back from this sort of endless treadmill effectively that they put people, that people seem to go on. As a wonderful op-ed in the New York Times by somebody saying, I hate my Peloton leaderboard. And I love Peloton, by the way. I think it's the most motivational exercise platform I can imagine. But I think there has to be a broader view of it, that it's not just, trying to optimize your numbers and look what you did today. And maybe you could do it even slightly faster for a personal record tomorrow. There's a broader vision. And among the things the broader vision encompasses are or connection, purpose. A lot of studies, the Harvard study of adult development highlights the role of warm personal relationships in longevity and healthy aging. Also, the Northwestern Superager study, which shows that people who are like 80 are the brains of a 50-year-old. It's from being like warm relationships over their life with others and really valuing that. Also, a sense of purpose. There's actually this dose relationship of all things between people who have a higher sense of purpose, have a decreased rate of mortality. It's sort of this amazing sort of a JAMA network paper that you can find. But on top of that, I'm really impressed by the importance of agency and the feeling that you can make a difference. This is stuff that Seligman has talked about, and this is not like putting on a happy face on everything. Shit happens in the world. Like, there are tons of really bad things. So it's not like, oh, put a happy face and like your cancer will be cured, if only, or your dementia will be cured. But the idea is that by being more agentic, we can not just live a healthier life, not just approach things more constructively in all our engagements, all our interactions, but also a more fulfilled life, and be able to connect more with others, to be able to have the best chance of having the most impact, and to be engaged and absorbed by the process of doing it.
Thank you. Well, good. Well, so many thanks, David. Many thanks to our audience for participating as well.
Thanks for sticking with us.
Any final thoughts for our audience?
No, I think that the opportunities of technology and health are incredible and important. I think that, just to pick one example, that there's a big difference between things not working and not working yet. So I think about things like open evidence, just as one example, where I remember I wrote a piece like maybe 10 years ago saying, I can't believe that even in this digital age, the number one like medical app, more or less, is what do you call it? It's this note engine thing. It's this note thing where I can't believe I'm blacking on it. But anyway, up to date. It's up to date, where it's like all these doctors write these great notes that sort of like summaries of things. And like when you'd see patients, everyone would like use it instead of the medical textbook. So it replaced medical text. It was like an electronic textbook. And then even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it was the go-to reference for every medical person. You had a question, you'd look it up on Up to Date. And then suddenly, like really, and all at once, boom, like now everyone's using open evidence. Like everybody is using it. Like, yes, there's still some users for Up to Date, but it's really just like things don't change until suddenly they do. And so you sort of have to recognize that just the way no one was using open evidence, now suddenly everyone's using it, that just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it can happen or that it's not going to happen. You sort of have to have the imagination to, I'm not going to say manifest the future, but at least to try to envision it. And if you believe in it, invest agency and drive towards it to try to make, things better.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for joining the show. So you've been listening to the Digital Health Investor Talk show with host Stephen Wardell. And many thanks to our guest, David Shaywitz. We'll be publishing this show on the Digital Health Investor Talk Show channel on Apple and Spotify. Please subscribe and rate us. We love every 5-star review. And our next show coming up is Wednesday, March 25th with Chris Michalek, and our topic is consolidation in the employer health tech sector. So thank you, David.
Oh, thank you for hosting me.